Welcome to The Perspective. And to those of you tuning in for the second time, thank you very, very much for the comments. Greatly appreciated. And as was the case last week, we have two absolutely top guests from the world of football writing. We won't always be doing this. We're, unlike the late and lamented Sunday supplement, we will be casting our net a little bit wider. For example, we're hoping to have a top agent on in the near future, also a current football player, an international player and current player who scored one of the greatest goals ever seen in the Premier League. But enough of that. For the time being, we are concentrating on the very top of football journalism. And to that end, we have here Art de Roché of The Athletic, shortlisted for Young Journalist of the Year. Is that right, Art?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he said.
I won't talk about it too much, but yeah.
And, well, our other guest, Miguel Delaney of The Independent, is no stranger to the awards podium himself. I think the latest one was the fans. Did you get the fans award?
Yeah, FSA, yeah. Four-time loser.
Oh, that's brilliant. But you're going to need that medal, that shortlisting medal for the fans when it comes to the discussion later about whether football journalists are biased. But you're definitely going to need that. But anyway, great to have you both. And there's so much to cover this week. We better get cracking straight away.
Yeah,
and there's only one place to begin, and that's with the team of the weekend.
West Bromwich Albion. I mean, absolutely sensational performance against Chelsea. Tore them apart, I thought. I'll come to Miguel first. How important do you think that victory could be for West Brom in terms of the relegation battle? Because we saw Fulham lose, we saw a Newcastle draw. We'll come on to that later. But how important could that victory be?
Well, I mean, if they are going to produce one of these escapes, they basically needed some sort of jolt like this sooner or later. And so from that perspective, it was everything you'd want in that it just the nature of the win, the way suddenly they were pouring goals. It is the sort of performance that can just provide an electric bolt through a club. Allardyce, of course, as we know too well, because precisely the sort of personality who will use that, try and galvanise the team from it. And all of a sudden, from a situation that looked hopeless, that was what was so striking about the results, that the nature of the win was just so starkly different from pretty much the context of it in everything that had gone before. And now the outlook is totally different, and there'll be a lot of optimism now.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, Callum Robinson, I thought he was terrific in the performance. The sending off definitely was a catalyst, I think, for the tide turning in the game. I'll come to Art for this. If West Brom did survive this, would this be Sam Allardyce's biggest ever achievement in his management career?
I think potentially, when you look at how he was perceived when he took the job, I think everybody probably, on the outside anyway, thought, and probably did up until they beat Chelsea, thought that West Brom would get relegated because of the situation they were in. And I think we've got to also remember how, I guess, unpopular a decision it was from the outside again when they sacked Slaven Bilic after beating Manchester City. And I think for Sam Allardyce, where this game can be instrumental is where the Manchester United result wasn't, where obviously they go ahead against Manchester United and then Bruno Fernandes scores just before half time and they have the life sucked out of them. And I think that's just building on this and building momentum will be very important for the end of the season. Of course, they've still got a game in hand over Fulham as well. That's important to remember. And obviously, we all know West Brom have done this before in 2004, 2005. So if there's an extra bit of motivation with Sam Allardyce and how he was perceived when he took charge, I think that can only help them going forward.
You talk about perception, Art, and I mean, the perspective is for football lovers. That's why we're all here. Were we not all drooling at the quality of that football that West Brom provided? I mean, probably it's the kind of thing you might, if suddenly you change the shirts to blue and whatever Barcelona's colours are. Yeah, it was fantastic football, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think we can't really undersell how big the red card was. I don't feel.
Yeah, true.
Because I know sometimes people say, "Oh, it's harder to play against 10 men," but the fact is, it's probably harder when those 10 men are all camped in their own box. Chelsea didn't do that, and that's where the space kind of opened up for West Brom, and they were able to carve them apart. And you've seen as Omar mentioned earlier, Callum Robinson's movement up until added time in the second half.
Yeah.
If you're moving off the ball, teams aren't going to be able to live with that, especially if they're a man down. And I think that is where West Brom really excelled at Stamford Bridge, having the courage, I guess, to play their game, even with the circumstances maybe in their favor. They still tried to take the game to Chelsea, which is where they profited.
I mean, mathematically, this could be the start of an escape for West Brom. And obviously, the teams, as a Fulham season ticket holder, I'm acutely aware that the teams most threatened by this would be Fulham and Newcastle United. Miguel, is it feasible? What would you put the odds of West Brom getting out of this?
I mean, at the moment, I have to say it's drastically changed since Saturday. Like before that, we genuinely thought it was hopeless.
Yeah.
And now you're kind of thinking, with the way it's going, with the way at that stage, at that end of the table, and at this stage of the season, suddenly 2 wins can just change perspective completely. Not just in the way it shortens the gap, but also, I suppose, the psychological effect. And that suddenly teams above them are they're not just looking up; they're looking down at what's coming behind them. That was precisely what happened to Fulham in 2008 themselves, where there was that emotional spike from and a kind of momentum from those wins. And it's why next weekend is suddenly very interesting. If West Brom get any sort of result at all, then it really is open. I mean, as to your question and to the odds, I mean, I'd still say they've got an awful lot to do, but it's not remote. Maybe 1 in 3, around that. But I mean, that's a lot better than it was a few weeks ago, or even last week.
Well, they certainly believe in their manager, Omar. And I mean, do the other two? Do Fulham and Newcastle?
Well, let's talk about Newcastle United now. And I want to bring in a comment from a fan, because Paddy stirred up a bit of a debate on his social media if there is a potential unconscious bias within the football media world. And a lot of Newcastle United fans seemingly piped up and voiced their emotions. And I'm going to raise a tweet that was spoken about by a man called Martin Johnson. And he said, this was before the result against Spurs. He said, given the lack of objectivity over Steve Bruce by certain journalists, I'd say absolutely. Whatever your opinion of Newcastle United as a club, 2 wins in 20 with this squad is a disgrace and will get him sacked at any other club, and rightly so. I will come to Miguel. Do you think Steve Bruce is still lucky to be in the job, or do you think there was a bit of encouragement from yesterday's result?
I think he's lucky to be in the job, I have to say. And I mean, I quite like Steve Bruce. He's decent to work with and to cover. But I suppose I've also written this season, I think the type of football he plays is about 10 to 15 years out of date. It's very much it's existence football, which is probably what completely appeals to Mike Ashley at the moment, because I remember speaking to people that work with Bruce, and and the way he approaches games and all that. And supposedly his belief is that really a lot of football comes down to the quality of your players. So if you have a squad that's better than 3 other clubs in the Premier League, you'll stay up. And that feels like it's been very much Mike Ashley's thinking, given that his time at Newcastle has been almost punctuated by spells where he's not spending anything, or the club isn't spending anything, and fans get very disgruntled. And then suddenly, when it looks like they might dip off, they go in a little bit of a splurge and get the signings they need. And I suppose you would think Callum Wilson might have been that sort of signing in the summer, and maybe because he's a goal scorer, the player to keep him up. But it's just been so drab, and even allowing for that squad. I think they're underperforming. I don't think they should be as low as they are. And given also the amount of controversy that's surrounded the season with incidents and headlines, like the latest kind of bust-ups and things like that. And yesterday's result notwithstanding, I do think he's fortunate in the job. And I think if it was any other ownership regime, Bruce would have lost his job by now.
Yeah, it's an interesting one with Newcastle, I always find, because if you speak to the supporters, they always have such high expectations because we remember what Newcastle United were like in the 90s, fighting for titles. Do you think maybe their expectations are sometimes too high, in a sense, because we've seen what the ownership of, I mean, you touched upon Mike Ashley and his ownership regime. Do you think Newcastle United fans have too many high expectations for where the club should be under Mike Ashley?
No, I think that's a little bit of a myth, I have to say, or has become one, because I think they've had a fair dose of reality for the past 10 years, though. It's like this in a lot of modern football now, especially with the economic stratification of the game and how there are glass ceilings up and down the league. Yeah. It's really just about, for a lot of fans, and I mean, this has been an issue at West Brom as well. It's about going to watch your team and having a bit of a sense of hope and excitement about it. And Bruce's football generally hasn't offered that.
I mean, that's certainly what I hear from Newcastle fans. Usually, when I've annoyed them about something, Newcastle fans are like a lot of fans. They say, "Oh yeah, you London metropolitan elite." I'm talking about what I used to be, not what I am now. And you never cover our club. And then so you write a piece about Newcastle and they say, keep your nose out of our business. You don't understand Newcastle. So, sometimes you can't win as a journalist with fans, but the Newcastle ones are great, actually. They are brilliant. And I completely agree with Miguel that one thing that infuriates them more than anything else is they're being told that they've got a sense of entitlement. And that they think that just because they're Newcastle, they're just not like that. The truth is that this dose of reality that Miguel says has been bashing them on the head for the last, to mix a metaphor, over the last 10 years. It's probably every year since 1973, isn't it? When they last won a trophy. So yeah, I think that it is largely mythical that they have a sense of entitlement that they should be big, but under this, your question was under this regime. Of course not. They're exactly where this regime almost seems to want them to be. What do you see about? How do you look at Newcastle Art? I mean, as a young man, and of course everybody else except me is a young man, but you as a young man, do you buy into this sort of Newcastle is a huge club thing, or do you just see them as what they have been in your recent work in life?
I think they are still a big club. You can't really take away a club's stature just because of, say, how they're performing in the league. I think historically that they will always be one of the clubs in England that is looked at as a big club. Just that I think when it comes to, say, like the expectation point Omar raised, that it's quite similar to Crystal Palace in a way. Obviously totally different clubs. I'd say Newcastle are the bigger club, but when you look at the situation Crystal Palace are in with Roy Hodgson, looking at the fan base, they want Crystal Palace to be playing a lot better football with the players that they have. It's like Wilfred Zaha, Eze, Jaro Riederwald as well. The squad that they have, they could probably play more adventurous football. And I think that comes into the hope aspect as well that Miguel mentioned, where, say, 9 years ago, Newcastle had players like Hatem Ben Arfa, Yohan Cabaye, Demba Ba, who gave fans hope, I think. When you then strip that down to the bare minimum and you're playing to exist, you then lose that. And I think as someone who is now 22 years old, 23 in the summer, I think Newcastle have always been a club where, even though they've been relegated a few times, in my in my time alive. I do still view them as one of the clubs of England when thinking about football and the Premier League or Premiership, if you want to call it that still.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that there isn't, I wouldn't say there's a sense of entitlement, but I do still feel that they are a club of stature in England.
We talk about clubs of stature in England, and I'm going to come on to your beloved club, which is Arsenal. And one topic I'm really interested to get into with you is the progress under Mikel Arteta. He's averaged 1.8 points per game, according to transfermarket.com. Do you think there is progress under Mikel Arteta? I mean, you won an FA Cup. We clearly know what he wants to implement in terms of his style of play, but you are where you are, and the defeat to Liverpool was poor, I think. So what's your assessment on that?
Yeah, I think obviously at the point we're at now, we're 50 games in to Mikel Arteta's time at Arsenal, and obviously when you reach those landmarks, you can get the statistical data and maybe question whether he was better than Unai Emery or Arsene Wenger in his last 50 games. I know Sky Sports did their kind of data table where they had all the stats, and I think Mikel Arteta was probably lowest of the three. But with that, I think you lose the nuance in what has happened since he's taken charge at Arsenal, not just in terms of the pandemic, because that's affected every club. So you can't really just say that's an Arsenal problem. But when you look at Arsenal, since he's come in, the restructuring of the club has changed drastically. When you think he came in as head coach, and then after winning the FA Cup, days after winning the FA Cup, there's the 55 redundancies that are made. Then almost a week later, Raul Sanllehi leaves the club as the chief recruiter, basically, and that job is taken by Arteta, who has his job changed from head coach to manager. And I think with that comes less time to work on what he actually wants to work on the pitch. And I don't think that's taken into consideration a lot of the time. But then you do have to live with the fact that Arsenal aren't winning as many games, scoring as many goals as they were under either Unai Emery or Arsene Wenger. And that's something that is a problem, especially when you look at how they were playing earlier in the season before they moved to the 4-2-3-1, where it was almost just like pulling teeth to try and create a one goal scoring chance in the game. Obviously, that's changed now with how Emile Smith-Rowe and Bukayo Saka have played since the move to a more conventional formation, I'd call it. But again, those issues still remain. I think the main probably positive of Mikel Arteta in his time in charge has been how he's changed Arsenal defensively. They're not as porous as they were under either Emery or Wenger, but again, they still need to find a consistent way to break teams down and score goals, which is what he will be judged on. I think stylistically there is more of an identity there, but again, it's just about getting that producing with that style on a more consistent basis. So in terms of progress, I think that's where it has been, but consistency is their main issue.
Yeah, and I think you touched on some really important points there. The touch on the positive side of things, the rise of Bukayo Saka, the rise of Emile Smith-Rowe, and I also think Kieran Tierney. He's developed into one of the best left backs in the country. Every time I see him, I think he's got everything, as a left back. And this is not me trying to please Paddy because he's a Scottish supporter.
I was just going to say he had a bit of a career before he went to Arsenal.
But also, I think with the negatives comes Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang. I'll come to Miguel on this. What do you think has been the problem with Aubameyang this season? I mean, he's 32. He's coming on to the age of 32. He's on 350k a week. He's meant to be Arsenal's captain. Do you think there's been a decline in his game?
Well, I mean, it has to be said, given the age he's at, players like Robert Lewandowski notwithstanding, it's rare enough forwards go from strength, particularly pace-based forwards, which is what Aubameyang is. It's rare enough they go from strength to strength at that age. So you would question the logic of giving him such a contract at that point in his career. But of course, I suppose it was one of those situations, a little bit like what happened with Alexis Sanchez and particularly Mesut Ozil before, where the contract came to symbolize something else for the club than the contract they were giving him. And it does mean now that, I mean, Arsenal could well be in a bit of an Ozil situation without having all the more so because there are times, and I was at the game on Saturday, it was one of them where it felt like Aubameyang's game was kind of out of sync with what Arteta's trying to do, which is, very collective, every like a real kind of cohesion with defense and attack in terms of pressing and all the rest of it. Yet this was a match where he was almost completely isolated because they spent most of it defending. They didn't have anyone to shuttle the ball to him, and he just felt apart from the team. And that he has got some big goals this season, but that has been a repeated problem, and it feels like it's one that could grow. And I mean, again, it does just remind of the Ozil situation that way. I mean, if obviously without some of the parameters, but there is the threat of it.
Do you see that pattern emerging?
I wouldn't say it'd be as extreme
Yeah.
as the Ozil situation due to the fact that, one, he is captain of Arsenal and he's a very popular figure with Arteta and the players. And I do feel that this season has had some lasting effects of last season where when Mikel Arteta first came in, there was a drastic change in the demands of players off the ball. So there were times, I remember Chelsea at home, Everton at home as well, where Aubameyang, that was when he was playing mostly on the left wing, is tracking all the way back next to Kieran Tierney, basically, or Bukayo Saka when he was playing left back. And then when you're asking him to run all the way forward off the back of that and win you games as well, I think that's going to have an inevitable effect in the coming months. And that's what one factor I think that has played into, say, this drop in form this season. But with that, I do also think that there is some accountability that he has to take where, say, when he's playing through the middle, he's probably not as natural there in terms of what Mikel Arteta wants his striker to do when linking play and bringing others into the game, as, say, Alexandre Lacazette. But then you've got the issue where Lacazette doesn't have the pace that Aubameyang has.
No.
So you're kind of wanting a mix of the two.
Mix them together. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's where you kind of get, say, an issue like Miguel mentioned, where he is almost set apart from the team in his abilities, but he is so essential because he has scored so many goals for Arsenal. But with that being said, I do think that there are times where he does work extremely well when he's playing centrally, when the players around him probably suit him better, where I think, say, a more creative player that floats like Emile Smith-Rowe kind of complements him a lot better because there is that room to interchange off the left-hand side, and for Emile Smith-Rowe to come into central areas where those two players can do both and excel. I think the Leeds match was probably the best example of that. But again, it's about finding the best way to play at a consistent level, and I don't think Arteta has found the formula for those guys to work as well as they can at the moment. But with the Europa League coming up, that's going to be very important.
Yeah, I mean, as bad as Arsenal were, we have to commend the performance of Liverpool. I thought they played terrifically well, and I'll come to Miguel. Was Gareth Southgate wrong in omitting Trent Alexander-Arnold, and did Saturday's match prove that?
I have to say, I've found it almost felt like one of those discussions that, purely because it happened around England, it was given far more weight than you would usually. I mean, ultimately, Trent Alexander was a player who hasn't been on his best form this season. There's also the issue that Southgate doesn't use fullbacks like Klopp does. I think that's pretty big in this and could yet be relevant to the Euros. Like I do think Trent Alexander-Arnold is, in terms of pure talent, probably one of the best players England have. And I wouldn't leave him out on that principle alone. But I mean, as with international management and all things like this, there are caveats to that. And one of them is basically Kieran Trippier's interpretation of a fullback is actually closer to what Southgate wants. I mean, people might think that's illogical. They might think but it is at least consistent decision making in Southgate. Now, what might happen is that could prove to be maybe one of the best things that happened to Trent Alexander's season, because it was difficult not to think that he responded to it on Saturday, although I think his form has been improving over the last few weeks. And one of the things we hadn't really seen as much was that quality delivery that we saw on Saturday, which was, I mean, Paddy, of course, would have covered the United treble season like so much, but again, it was like it was a perfect Beckham ball almost. I know that's been said a lot, but that's what it looks like.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think Trent Alexander, although he's a number 2, ostensibly, he's one of the best creative footballers in the country, and to an extent, he's redefined the position. He's redefined the corner kick. That's for sure. Barcelona know that. He's. Yeah. I mean, he is. He's. It'd be very surprising if he doesn't end his career as a great player, a truly great player. He's just something completely different. But he's not the greatest defender in the world, and for a lot of the time this season, he's actually been a weakness upon which other teams have fed. And my own club, Fulham, just went for the space behind the Liverpool fullbacks, particularly the right back, and should have beaten Liverpool. Aston Villa put Grealish against Trent Alexander-Arnold and won 7-2. So he's not perfect, and then there are issues about delicate balances which Klopp has obviously worked out and can use him as a creative right winger or whatever you like to call him, and make sure that he's in defensive positions enough to make it logical. But yes, let's get one thing out. I share Miguel's skepticism, and let's get one thing out of the way, that if, in my opinion, the chances of Trent Alexander not being part of England's Euro squad are about the same as Donald Trump making a political comeback as the new leader of the Labour Party. And I think that, let's take all the journalism out of it. Player is left out once is not a huge story. It's and the person most appreciative of Trent Alexander's magnificent performance at Arsenal would have been Gareth Southgate. So these things, it's part of international management. There are certain players that you can give a little reminder to, and Trent Alexander-Arnold being so absolutely comfortable in his own exceptional ability is one that you can give a kick up the backside to now and again. Now that's an unnecessarily undignified way of putting it, but international management is about understanding what you can and can't do, and also you have to bear in mind one other thing. God forbid that Trent Alexander-Arnold fractures a metatarsal 2 days before the squad has to be finalized for the Euros. What does he say to Aaron Wan-Bissaka or whoever comes in? I didn't even want you, but now because Trent's injured. So you've got to keep everybody happy. You've got to give everybody hope. That's the skill of international management, and I believe that Gareth Southgate has it in bucket loads.
So we'll go from one club in the Northwest to the other. I want to quickly touch upon Manchester United. They won 2-1 against Brighton. A Mason Greenwood header secured the 3 points for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's side. I'm going to come to Art. Simple question: Dean Henderson or David De Gea?
stylistically, Dean Henderson. I
Why?
think because when you look at the two profiles of the goalkeepers, Dean Henderson is probably a bit closer to what Ole Gunnar Solskjaer wants from a goalkeeper. I wouldn't say De Gea's old school in terms of the way he plays, but compared to Dean Henderson, he likes to stay quite close to his goal, I think. And when you have a goalkeeper who's willing to, I guess, push the boundaries a bit more, that helps when you want your team to push the boundaries a bit more. When playing out the back, but also pushing the team a bit higher when you're defending. So that's why I'd probably say Dean Henderson in that debate.
It's an interesting one because David De Gea has been such a top class keeper for United for so long, but then I think that there was a massive drop up in his game after the 2018 World Cup. We saw the mistake he made for Spain there, and last season he made numerous mistakes for spilling the ball. Miguel, what's your opinion on it? Do you think it's time that David De Gea leaves Old Trafford and goes to a new club?
It does feel it's getting close to that, and interestingly, I suppose the drop off he's had since 2018, which really was, I mean, that was all the more notable because it was at a time when he was absolutely brilliant for United, arguably had his best individual season for United, and was actually a large reason they finished second that season. Given Mourinho was sacked a few months later, which probably reflected a lot of the performance at the time. But it was also then when he finally got into the Spain team as their number one goalkeeper, and that had enormous drop off for Spain. And I remember talking to people around at the time, and one of the theories or explanation was that because Spain are a team, probably almost more than anyone else in the modern game, along with Guardiola's Barcelona, popularized the kind of the properly ball-playing goalkeeper, that his confidence went when he kind of struggled with that with Ramos and Piqué in front of him. And you could almost see it visibly on the pitch at the time as well, where it felt like that Piqué and Ramos often didn't have the confidence to play the ball back to him. And I suppose maybe that just created a cascading effect. And it has felt like his game has never really recovered. And of course, that I suppose reflects a few bigger things, but this debate about whether keepers do need to be as good at their feet as with their hands these days. I mean, I would still say ultimately stopping shots and having command of your keeper trumps everything in that. Sorry, having command of your area trumps everything in that regard. But maybe De Gea has been a bit more suspect there as well. But at the same time, there's been a few issues with Henderson. I mean, it was interesting yesterday in that game where Brighton, it felt like they repeatedly tried to test Henderson out by playing corners basically right on him and putting a few players on him. And he did struggle a few times. And it feels like there's a big decision to be made at Old Trafford soon. And certainly they can't persist with this where they effectively have two number ones or two halves, you might say.
Well, the big decision, the person who's going to be making that decision is Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. And Miguel, I've seen how critical you've sometimes been of Solskjaer. I know you're his biggest fan. Where would you assess how Manchester United are at the moment? Do you think they did? I mean, they're 4 points clear ahead of Leicester City. Do you think they are making progress under Solskjaer? Do you think he's implemented a popular style of play? What's your opinion on it?
Well, I think you have to accept, and I have been critical of Solskjaer, but he's done a much better job than I expected, I have to say. I don't think he's the best possible candidate United could have. That's a wider debate. But there has been a lot of value in what he's done. I think his side has been very good in terms of man management. The players like him. The Pogba situation is a credit to him. There are, I mean, yesterday was almost a classic United game in that regard, in that they weren't all that convincing. And this has happened a lot this season, but yet they still got the job done. And there were flaws within the team. Now, I suppose right now, it really depends on your perspective what those results mean. Either they're just flaws that will be solved in the developing team, or they're flaws that are pretty inherent to what Solskjaer does that will always undermine them. And I suppose the next season will start to tell us that, because it is beginning to get a little bit of a crunch point. I think you would forgive Solskjaer a certain amount, or sorry, allow him a certain amount up to now, but we are soon getting to the point where he probably has to win a trophy, and the Europa League does offer a source of that. And to be fair, I think finishing second in the league behind this City would also represent progress. I mean, it looks like he's going to greatly improve on last season's points return. I mean, there is more of a sense of a team coming together, but still with issues, and one of them is the goalkeeper. And that's, but to be fair to Solskjaer, he has been good in these personnel decisions so far.
We're really supposed to be talking about top clubs. We get accused of talking about top clubs too much, and there's only one top club in the Premier League, and that's Man City. Now, Miguel, do you get accused of being biased against Man City more than any other club?
Yeah, probably, without a doubt, I'd say, and that all stems ultimately from how we covered not the league win in the 2018-19 season, but the FA Cup final win, because I felt, I mean, at the time, it was something I'd been kind of conscious of a lot. Well, there was two issues. One was this kind of financial stratification of the game, which I've done a lot on this, and I think it's going to be disastrous for football, to be honest. It's basically eroding its fundamental unpredictability, and it's to a level we've never seen before. I know people go on about Liverpool in the 80s, United in the 90s, but the actual economic gaps have never been greater, and that we've seen that the effect of that all over Europe. Secondly, and this is something that's always bubbled under, but I still don't think it's actually confronted enough. It's what the City ownership actually are, and by extension, I suppose, what are the intentions of the club? And like when you talk to human rights groups, they all talk about sports washing. And to be honest, I mean, this is probably a bit puritanical of me, but my view would be it's ultimately a pro-City view to be concerned about how the club is being used, or what any ownership intends. But I suppose some people just do, for some people, any sort, I suppose this is the nature of tribalism, but anything which isn't kind of perceived to be supportive of a team or praise what they're doing is seen as anti a club. But I think the reality is much more complex than that.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I agree with you 100%. I think all the glee at the collapse of financial fair play, or semi-collapse, was totally misplaced. But do you feel as strongly about Chelsea?
Well, it's different with Chelsea. I think what concerns me is that Chelsea are another example of a super club. With the way the future of football is developing, and I think the Neymar transfer was a real landmark in this. And from speaking to people close to Paris Saint-Germain, this is a very definitive tactic where they know if prices and wages and fees are driven up to these astronomical levels, they know that there are only a few clubs that can compete. That's Manchester City, who are Abu Dhabi owned, or at least Sheikh Mansour is a member of the royal family, and Khaldoon Al Mubarak, chairman of the club, is the de facto prime minister of Abu Dhabi with quite significant political influence. That's PSG, obviously, who are Qatar owned. That's the potential club owned by Saudi Arabia, which is why I've got some grief from Newcastle fans. And then, of course, there's Manchester United, who are absolute money-making machine, even in spite of the ownership of the Glazers and what that's done to the club.
A very dubious model, that one. And we don't like the ownership of Newcastle United one little bit.
Exactly.
We may have mixed feelings about the ownership of Arsenal, Art. I mean, briefly. I mean, very briefly, because I want to continue the theme of bias and so on. I mean, could Arsenal's ownership be questioned? Could the ambition of Arsenal's ownership be questioned?
Yeah, I think it has been questioned for the past decade or so.
True.
Probably
always first with the news, Art. But but no. So in other words, you look all over the country, and increasingly you don't like the owner. We don't like the ownership model, and we wish it was the same as a German one.
Yeah.
But do you think that all right, let me ask a question to all four of us. Is there a club in our hearts? Do you have a club, Miguel? Do you have an English club in your heart that you love more than any other?
No, not personally.
Uh,
Well, I'm Irish Spanish, so
yeah. All right.
But actually, I mean, in terms of what you're talking about, though.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about what ownership models and what's good for the game, because ultimately this is why I think this is what's so core to this whole issue. Football clubs, as I suppose is what your question implies, they're ultimately representations of community. They're about, you know, a core people identity, and that's what they should exist for, solely for the purpose of playing and representing. But because of the financial growth of the game, and because of the game is basic, it's a complete embrace of hypercapitalism, any sort of protections for what are social institutions. It means it's grown to this size, and it's political size, where it's appealing to, you know, basically every business interest that you can think of. And hence we have these ownership models, like on one side, something quasi-political like Paris Saint-Germain or Manchester City, and on the other side, this kind of purely financial, which is Manchester United, Liverpool, and Arsenal. And the core issue there is that the club is no longer solely existing for the purpose of playing and winning and representing. There are other goals. So, I mean, I'm supposed to give you an example. This is an interesting one because the EU recently ruled against this. But my mother's local club in Spain, who I also support, Osasuna, they're one of only 4 clubs in Spain who have been allowed or have developed through this membership model. Now that model has a lot of problems, as we've seen with Barcelona and Real Madrid, but its fundamental principle, I think, if run in the right way, is really something that clubs should be aspiring to. And it's at the very least comparable to the German model, which because it's ultimately it's owned by the fans. Now that has produced some flaws, but there are flaws that can be, you know, over time and with the right governance can be undone. But I think its principle is correct, and it means there's still a representation angle to the ownership that is no longer evident in a lot of England's biggest clubs in that way.
Mm. Do you like Manchester City Football Club?
Well, I mean, the first stadium I ever went to in England when I was playing for Greystones United, my home club in Ireland, and you know we did one of those trips, and it was the first game I ever went to watch in England was Manchester City against Sheffield Wednesday, Main Road. So yeah, I mean, I love the city of Manchester. There's no issue with the club. If the issue is what is the current ownership of the club, and what its intentions are. And I think there are absolutely very legitimate questions that, when people talk about bias, but my bias in this case would be to journalism and what the ethical story is to cover. And for me, there are huge questions there that journalists should be covering, because they are central to the future of the club, the future of the game, and how football is used. Mm-hmm. And let's not forget, as cases like Peter Swales illustrate, or whoever you want to pick, ownerships aren't eternal. They are not the club. They're just temporary.
It's interesting you raised the point about journalism as well. I'll come to Art with this question. Art, do you think there is an unconscious bias in football journalism?
So I can only speak for myself, and I would say no. I will give an example of, say, how I write. I think a lot of people probably know I'm very I talk about football most of the time. So that's where I guess there isn't really much room for bias, because people would be able to know if you're not talking correctly. So an example would be maybe at Arsenal, the right back situation is probably one that needs to be sorted out. Find the first choice right back. I wrote about that in, I think, early February or late January. And yes, I've got my own opinions, but with Cedric and Bellerin, who are the 2 people I'm writing about, I will have to highlight the pros and cons of both players, whoever I think is the better option. And I think that's, for me to kind of put that into perspective so I can answer. That's where you lose the bias, because you have your evidence in front of you and you just you have to present it whatever way it looks. even if it is ugly for a particular person, you've
Yeah.
got to present that evidence. And I don't think you can kind of put one piece of evidence to the wayside just because you think it doesn't suit your argument. You have to bring through what is the truth. And I think people would be able to read through that if you didn't.
Yeah. I mean, I know that journalists are well, again, I like Art, I can only speak for myself, but I think I am typical of football writers. And for 40 years, I was completely unbiased. And I know this because I was biased against Man United, Man City, Rangers, Celtic. I was biased against all of them and also biased in favor of all of them. And I have this documentary proof that I was biased. In actual fact, I only really gave a stuff about one result any weekend, and that was Dundee. And I never covered Dundee, I don't think. So, I mean, that you have a bias filter. And I can remember when I went in the summer, sometimes late summer, I would go on a holiday to Dundee, and I'd go to as many Dundee matches as possible in the early season. And I'd go with my mates, and they thought I was mad because I was a journalist. They would, our defender would clatter into the back of their striker, St. Mirren's striker or something, and all the guys around me would say, "Referee, that was never a foul, you bloody idiot," and I was saying, well, it actually was a foul. It was a really bad foul. And they would look at me as if I was mad, because a journalist is a different species. He might be biased. And actually, I've got a lovely tweet from somebody who says, yeah, but what about all these copites? And they list a load of journalists, including Tony Evans, definitely guilty. But Tony Evans, when writing about Liverpool, he would be a little bit like Art. He would write mainly about Liverpool. Liverpool would be a specialist subject. But if he was talking about something else, he wouldn't have a pro-Liverpool agenda when discussing Manchester City, for example. We don't. And it's difficult, really, to convince people. For example, referees. You would want referees to have a favorite team, because having a favorite team is, with all due respect, Miguel, and you've got Osasuna. Is that not a favorite team?
Yeah.
If you,
I mean,
you've got a favorite.
Yeah,
you can't have for a football fan, it is natural to have a favorite team, to have a team in your heart. But that doesn't mean that if a referee is going to be constantly thinking, oh, I'm doing West Brom against Chelsea today. Who do I want to win? Because I'm really an Everton fan. I mean, it just does not happen. And it's the same with journalists.
I see. When you're working as well, just it's not quite a different mindset. It's an extension of I mean, like what we've got into football journalism really because we love football. I mean, it comes ultimately from support. But an extension of that is, once you go into the job, you apply different principles and think about it in a different way, and it becomes about assessing what's in front rather than assessing what you want. And ultimately, and again, to repeat, I think the only thing we end up being biased to is the story and what's interesting. And I think that was something that actually really struck in the last few weeks. I mean, because when Liverpool were doing very well around kind of 2019-20, and we had to praise them, you get a lot of talk. Oh, you're a Liverpool. And funny enough, actually, in 2017-18, when they had the Centurion season, I had all sorts of Man United fans telling me, "Oh, you're so pro Guardiola. You love Man City." Well, so that switched around. But it becomes, I mean, you have to report in the football when things are going well. Inevitably, most of what you write will be praised, and when things are going badly, you look like you're overly critical of the team or whatever. But the one thing I did notice in terms of kind of journalists being biased to the story, it struck me when Liverpool lost to Fulham at home. I think I tweeted this. Basically, there's nothing like the electricity that runs through the rest of the game when a big club is suffering a crisis. That's when, it's not just journalists to kind of see, okay, there's something to get into here. Opposition fans absolutely love it. I mean, it's like this glee goes around, and I suppose that. But again, that's independent of the club. It's any big club really, because it's a big club.
So you're confessing to human nature.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically it. But Omar, you in your question referred to unconscious bias.
Yeah.
How could that work?
So say, for example, I think a lot of people forget, especially with football journalists, is that before you actually step into the profession, we were all football fans ourselves. And
Yes.
obviously, we all support a club. We all have a team we love and adore. And I think that because of that, some people might think, oh yeah, you're being biased to such and such because you've supported such and such, and I think that's where an argument exists from the football supporter that maybe perhaps they suggest that journalists are being biased towards the teams they support. In the case of Art, I know he covers Arsenal, but and I know he says that he doesn't think there's an unconscious bias. And to be honest with you, from hearing what he said, I completely agree with him, because I think once you, obviously I haven't stepped into a job yet, but I think once you step into a role as a journalist, that one of the main aspects of the job is to remain impartial, and I think that's at the forefront. With Art's case, especially, he touched on the right back situation. He debated, and he touched upon the pros and cons for Arsenal's right back. So yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think from what I've learned, yeah, journalists have to remain impartial. I think that's the key objective: accurate and impartiality. Really, I don't know what you guys had to make on that.
Yeah, I think obviously for myself as well, one question I'm asked by, say, younger guys is whether it's difficult to remain impartial while covering a club you actually support. And for me, not really, because you kind of distance yourself from emotion anyway, so you can actually see what's in front of you, because if you're viewing if I'm viewing an Arsenal game with emotion, obviously I'm going to be happy if they score and unhappy if they concede. But if you're viewing it from a totally emotional lens, like a fan, then you miss the real important parts of the game, which you may not pick up on. Say if you are a fan, say like just simple communications between players, you may not pick up on that if you're being emotional. And then that's a part of, I guess, it seems like such a little thing, but that detail can make such a difference in a piece, or say if you're doing a bit of post-match analysis or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, a journalist wouldn't last 2 minutes if he or she went to Stamford Bridge this weekend and came back and said nothing happened because Chelsea lost. That puts it in a nutshell. Sorry.
Just actually, as a little bit of an extension of that, I remember when I worked on the Sunday Tribune in Dublin, a former colleague, I won't name, but he was, because we were Sundays, we were often putting the overflow at games, and this was one particularly big Ireland game, and like, he just came into the office and he was complaining, and he just kind of almost to himself just shouts, "How am I supposed to analyze a game when beside me there's someone where everything is the fault of the ref?" Which I suppose was a nice little kind of.
Well, Miguel, that does remind me that we did actually get a tweet. It's unfortunate that we almost ran out of time, because we did get a tweet from a viewer who wanted to know your take on where next for the Republic of Ireland. But as I say, we are struggling for time, so we are going to have to invite you back on, maybe at a future international break, and have you analyze that for us. But thank you very, very much for coming, and thank you also to Art de Roché. It was absolutely fantastic to listen to Art as well. And also to you, Omar, as always. If I may pick you up on something, you said a moment ago that you don't have a job. Well, you damn well do. You're the lead presenter on the Perspective podcast. So if you can talk us out, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I just want to echo again what Patrick said. Thank you both so much for taking the time out.
Very enjoyable. Sorry about the slight delay at the start.
No problem at all. Just thank you so much for coming on. It's been a very enjoyable hour. Sorry, Art, for running over time. I know you had a 12 o'clock deadline. But yeah, as I said, everybody make sure you like, share, and subscribe to The Perspective. Follow us on Spotify. Yeah, subscribe on YouTube, and we will see you again for the next one. Cheers.
Thank you.